Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you all for coming for the ninth lecture of the Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. I am Professor Daniel Simão Nascimento, the organizer of this symposium, and the hosting for this meeting. As usual, I'd like to thank FAPERJ and CAPES for their financial support, and the members of the research groups Pragma, Uzia, and Polyphonia for their academic support. Today, we're joined by Professor Giles Pearson, who is delivering our lecture, and to debate his lecture, we have Professors Lucas Angioni from Unicamp, Gabriela Rossi from PUC de Valparaíso, and Breno Zupolini from Unifest. So let me briefly thank them all for joining us today, and without any more delay, welcome Professor Pearson to our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. Giles, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Daniel. And yeah, first, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for arranging this amazing seminar series, Daniel. Right, I'm going to try and share my screen. Are you seeing that, Daniel? Is that working?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, brilliant. So for some time, my conversation, my paper here is about Aristotle's account of the emotions, or an aspect of it. So for some time, commentators were divided between what I call judgmentalist and perceptualist readings of Aristotle. According to the judgmentalist view, which you find advanced by Fortenbaum and Martha Nussbaum, Aristotle holds that objects of emotions must be apprehended by belief or judgment. And since we apprehend objects of emotions by belief, we must assent that the objects of the emotions are the way the belief or the judgment represents them. According to the perceptualist view, by contrast, which is advanced by, for example, John Cooper and Gisela Stryker, he holds that objects of emotions must be apprehended by the perceptual capacity of fantasia. And it was stressed by Cooper and Stryker that Aristotle emphasizes just this feature of emotions to highlight how they can come apart from and indeed contradict our beliefs or judgments. And more recently, a view has emerged which undermines this simple division. According to a growing consensus, which you find variants of in Jessica Moss, Anthony Price, and Jamie Dow, while the perceptualist is right to think that Aristotle holds that objects of emotions must be apprehended by fantasia, so they agree with the perceptualist that objects of emotion must be apprehended by fantasia, the perceptual capacity of fantasia. Nonetheless, the judgmentalist is right to claim that Aristotle thinks that we must take a belief-like attitude towards those objects. So they think that we must nonetheless assent that the objects of emotions are as they are represented to us. So this kind of marries a bit of both, as it were. We have the perceptualist appeal to fantasia, that objects of emotion must be apprehended by fantasia, but we have the judgmentalist's idea that we need nonetheless to assent that the objects of emotions are as they are represented to us. Well, to distinguish this reading from both judgmentalists and perceptualists, but to reflect the fact that such views still maintain that only the perceptual capacity of fantasia ever apprehends objects of emotion, I call them quasi-perceptualist readings, right? So I call these readings quasi-perceptualists. Now, I reject all these readings. I reject a lot. On my view, Aristotle holds that objects of emotion can be apprehended by a variety of intentional states, so not just one. So they can be apprehended by belief, fantasia, but also perception and indeed uncommitted thoughts. And as this suggests, he doesn't think that assent, on my view, is required for emotion. So that would go specifically against the quasi-perceptualists and the judgmentalists. But I'm also resisting the perceptualist view, since I think that he thinks that beliefs can also apprehend objects of emotions. But it's the simple point that whether or not assent is required for emotion that is my concern in this paper. Against judgmentalists and quasi-perceptualist readings, if this is a feature they share, then I want to show that he doesn't think that assent is required for emotions. Well, how might you show this? Well, there are a number of passages that you might try to appeal to, for example, at the end of De Anima 3.3 or in De Insomniis. But I think that ultimately those are I'm not going to go into those today because I think they're a bit contentious and perhaps don't really show it. You might also try to appeal to recalcitrant emotions, that is, emotions that persist in the light a contrary judgment, because they would seem not to require assent if you judge contrary to them. But again, I think it's questionable about whether or not Aristotle even explicitly recognizes that there are such things as recalcitrant emotions. There's a few passages where he might, but it's highly contentious. So I'm going to focus on another sort of case or category of emotion that would seem to undermine the idea that assent, or potentially undermine the idea that assent is required for emotion. So I'm going to focus on Aristotle's understanding of our emotional responses to tragic drama. In the Poetics, Aristotle considers what he deems to be the appropriate emotional response to dramatic tragedy. Now, if he accepts that we can have genuine emotions, form genuine emotions in response to scenarios that we recognize to be fictional, so if he accepts that we can form genuine emotions in response to scenarios that we know full well are fictional, then the quasi-perceptualist and judgmentalist's thesis that he holds that we must assent that the object of emotion is as our emotion represents it must be mistaken, right? If we can form genuine emotions in response to scenarios that we know don't exist because they're fictional, then we don't have to assent that things are the way our emotion presents it. We can have, in order to have an emotion about it. Now, unsurprisingly, of course, my antecedent there, that if Aristotle accepts that we can have genuine emotions in response to scenarios that we recognize to be fictional, isn't universally accepted. And indeed, some of the quasi-perceptualists have explicitly rejected that. So how might they try and understand Aristotle's understanding of our emotional responses to fiction? Well, Anthony Price claims that without explicitly addressing the problem posed by our emotional responses to fiction, Aristotle appears to incline to a factive solution, he says, according to which what moves one in a play is not particular fiction, but egocentric truth. That is, not what does happen to a character in a play, but what one knows might happen to oneself. So what moves us in a play is not particular fiction, but egocentric truth. That is, not what does happen to a character in the play, the fictional object, but what one knows might happen to oneself. Now, this idea is similar to a somewhat less egocentric proposal, which has been considered by contemporary philosophers outside of the discussion of Aristotle. I mean, discussion of the understanding of fiction, primarily in aesthetics. Colin Radford characterized it as follows. He says, if and when we weep for Anna Karenina, we weep for the pain and anguish that a real person might suffer, and which real persons have suffered, and if her situation were not of that sort, we should not be moved. Radford is considering this proposal, he'll reject it. But so the idea is here, on this idea of understanding what we're doing when we're engaging with emotionally with a fictional object, is that we weep for the pain and anguish, with the case of Anna Karenina, that a real person might suffer, and which real persons have suffered. And if a situation wasn't like that, we wouldn't be moved. Okay, well, the view that Price is ascribing to Aristotle is a somewhat special instance of this proposal, where the person in question is always oneself. Now, this view, the view that Price is ascribing to Aristotle, is clearly even less plausible, I think, than the view that Radford is addressing, since it's even more restrictive. So I might be moved by the traumas of someone undergoing childbirth, or I might be moved by the prospect of the exhilaration of running like Usain Bolt in his prime, or of the difficulties of being brought up in war-torn Yemen. But these are not, I can guarantee it, things that I know might happen or have happened to myself, right? So the idea that the person is always in question, myself, is unduly restrictive in terms of our emotional responses to fiction. Jamie Dow offers Aristotle a view which is closer to the one that Radford was considering. He writes this. This is a quote from Dow. He writes, in their Poetics, Aristotle connects the action on stage to universal truths about people and their affairs. So perhaps part of what is happening when we experience pity and fear in response to tragedy is that we are really pitying and fearing features of our own condition or that of humans in general. If so, these would be things that the subject could, without any psychological malfunction, take to be the certain way without in any way compromising their grasp of the fictional nature of the individual characters and particular events represented on the stage. As with Price's reading, Dow is also another quasi-perceptualist, or at least later Dow is. He earlier advanced the judgmentalist view. Dow is suggesting that Aristotle holds that our emotional responses to fiction are not really about fictional objects. Instead, they're really about different non-fictional objects which serve as surrogates for those, serve as surrogates for the actual fictional objects which the fiction is about. But his all humans in general, which I put in bold there in Dow's formulation, allows that the emotions need not be directed at what one could feasibly view as pertaining to oneself, so long as they at least pertain to what real people do or might suffer. Okay. Now, what I want to say is that even this variation of the factive solution, one which extends it beyond the egocentric truth that we found in Price's reading, and extends it to human considerations or human concerns more generally, even this view of the variant of the factive solution seems objectionable. Radford, who I said was merely considering this view, but actually turns out to reject it, he puts the problem well, I think. He says, there's something in this proposal, but not enough to make it a solution. For we do not really weep for the pain that a real person might suffer, and which real persons have suffered when we weep for Anna Karenina, even if we should not be moved by her story, if it were not of that sort. We weep for her. We are moved by what happens to her, by the situation she gets into, and which is a pitiful one. But we do not feel pity for her state or fate, or her history or her situation, or even for others, i.e. for real persons who might have, or even have had such a history. We pity her, feel for her, and our tears are shed for her. This thesis is even more compelling, perhaps, if we think about the death of Mercutio. Clearly, Radford was very moved by the death of Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. But the point is, insofar as we agree with Radford that we can experience emotions directed at the fictional characters themselves, at the actual fictional characters themselves, then the interpretation that Dow and Price have proposed for Aristotle would be philosophically implausible. Of course, he could still hold that view, and that may well be his view, but his view would be philosophically unlikely. So if you accept that we can have genuine experience genuine emotions about fictional characters, and of course there are some contemporary views which dispute that, but if you accept that, then you want to know why Dow and Price think that Aristotle is committed to such a view, why he's committed to the idea that we can't have emotions directed at the fictional characters themselves. Well, Price's motivation is similar to that we saw in the passage I quoted earlier from Dow. Price writes this. He says, Aristotle famously holds that the poet presents not what has happened, but what would happen, expressing universals where history presents particulars. Pity is inspired by someone who is suffering undeservedly, fear by someone who is like ourselves. As Alexander Nehemus has put it, there's a quote within a quote, as Alexander Nehemus has put it, when I sympathize with Oedipus, I feel an imaginative fear for myself, one which is based on seeing myself as someone relatively similar to Oedipus. Indeed, Oedipus is a type, and one to which we may recognize ourselves as belonging. Accordingly, Aristotle, back in Price's voice, Aristotle advises the poet to set out his plot in universal terms before supplying the names and turning the story into episodes. Even emotionally, human reality is the core, fictitious characters are a covering. So that's Price's motivation. Now, what should we make of that? Well, Aristotle does indeed distinguish history from fiction on the ground that history seeks to portray what has happened, whereas dramatic fiction relates to things that may happen, i.e. that are possible in accordance with probability or necessity. So he does distinguish history from fiction on such a ground. And he links this idea to the claim that poetry tends to speak of universals, history of particulars, which is a point he glosses as follows. He writes, a universal is the sort of thing that a certain kind of person may well say or do in accordance with probability or necessity. This is what poetry aims at, although it assigns names to the people. In particular is what Alcibiades did or what he suffered. However, although the writer of dramatic fiction is not, on Aristotle's account, trying to relate to us what some actual person did, right? They're not trying to convey some historical story, a story about history. Instead, they're concerned with more universal themes about what could happen to human beings. Although I would add, though, there can be an element of the fantasy or the impossible in there as well. Although that's the case, this doesn't entail the reading that we're considering, right? It doesn't imply the factive solution. It doesn't imply that Aristotle holds that the emotions we experience about the fictional characters that the poet employs to represent such universal themes are not directed at the characters themselves. Remember, the factive solution suggests that they're really about what human beings in general, or ourselves, what could happen to us. That's what we're really having our emotions about, not the actual fictional characters. I mean, in one point here this is all this stuff about universal themes and so on, but it's rather hard to pity or fear a universal theme. But obviously, it's got to be, on their view, wrapped up in a fictional character. But nonetheless, it's sort of universal themes that we're being invited to think we're having our emotions ultimately about. We need to ask again, I think, what does Aristotle think the objects of pity and fear are in this context? So keeping this in view, we need to ask what he thinks the objects of pity and fear are in this context. Okay, well, to answer this, I think it's important. I said helpful on the slide, but I think it's actually important to treat the two emotions separately. And I think we're best off starting with pity. Okay, well, here are three possible objects of pity in this context, treating where the pity is going to be about the tragic hero in the tragic drama. Okay, so the pity could be directed at someone one takes to be real, right? It could be directed at someone that you actually take to be real. Or our pity, P2, so that was P1, P2, our pity could be directed at a fictional person, but just insofar as one imagines that person to be real, right? So his pity is directed at a fictional person, but insofar as you imagine the person to be real. Or we have P3, a pity which is directed at the fictional character as such. Now, I think the difference between P2 and P3 can be quite nicely illustrated by considering a case where a fictional story is placed within an actual historical event, right? So I think we can illustrate the difference between P2, where we have pity directed at a fictional person, but insofar as one imagines the person to be real or representative of something real, and P3, pity directed at the fictional character as such. I think we can see that difference if we consider cases where the fictional story is placed within an actual historical event. The example, let me give you an example. So in the movie Titanic, the fictional characters of Jack and Rose are placed into a piece of real history, namely the fateful voyage of the RMS Titanic in 1912. Now, we know full well Jack and Rose were invented characters, right? And we know that full well. Most moviegoers who go, they don't really believe that there were characters, Jack and Rose. They're fictional characters. Hence, we know in this case that P1's not in place, right? They're not. Our pity isn't directed at real characters because they're made up characters. But there are still two possibilities here. We might pity Jack being the one who dies. We might pity Jack insofar as we imagine that someone like Jack might have suffered some similar fate on the Titanic. So people did suffer similar sorts of fates to Jack, and although there was a fictional character there overlaid it, we might nonetheless we might imagine, well, people did undergo things like that, and our pity of Jack might in some way be parasitical on the emotion that we're really experiencing about someone who actually went something similar to what Jack underwent to. That's P2. Or we might pity Jack, the fictional character, knowing full well that no such person actually existed. So we might pity Jack, the fictional character himself, full of all his fictional definite descriptions, knowing full well that no such person actually existed. That would correspond to P3. Now, in conceding that there was something in the proposal that he rejected, as Radford did in the quotation I gave earlier, Radford was presumably acknowledging that emotions of the kind instanced by P2, where we've got the surrogate in play, can go on when we encounter fiction. We clearly can be moved by the fate of Jack insofar as the fictional character is some kind of poignant illustration of what might have happened to someone on the boat on the fateful voyage of Titanic, even if we know full well that the character of Jack, as portrayed in the movie, doesn't exist, and there's no evidence that anyone like Jack suffered in precisely that way. So Peter is clearly a possibility in this situation with stories like Titanic. That could well be quite often going on when people are having emotional responses. No one need deny that, right? Radford's point, rather, was that we also seem capable of experiencing emotions directed at Jack himself, even while knowing that no such person existed or actually suffered some such fate, and without even imagining the scenario in which someone like Jack existed and suffered some such fate. That is, on Radford's view, we also seem capable of emotions corresponding to P3. Well, what about Aristotle then? What should we say about Aristotle? Well, he clearly doesn't think that in experiencing pity in response to tragedy, we experience pity about someone we take to be real. He doesn't, that is, I take it, think that those watching dramatic tragedy believe that the events they're watching are actually taking place, either in the amphitheatre itself or where the narrative says they're taking place, nor does he, I would suggest, think that they should be construed as believing that the events really did take place in the past, i.e. somehow they're having emotions about putatively historical events. I mean, that would, for one thing, that would neglect the fact that there's no reason to believe that they couldn't have been fully aware of the fact that these things weren't history and were fictional events. But there's another important point here which reveals that this isn't the case. It can be seen by the fact that he thinks that besides experiencing pity and fear in response to these dramatic tragedy, these dramatic events, the viewers take pleasure in watching dramatic tragedy, which would hardly be the case if they were actually taken in by the narrative or viewed it as, some historical event. We wouldn't be taking, if you're experiencing, horror at some horrific, past events, the Holocaust or something like that, no one's taking pleasure in that. So insofar as people are taking pleasure in watching dramatic tragedy, and that's integral to the process as Aristotle construes it, he clearly doesn't think that his audience take these events to be real in any of the senses which I've just sketched. So he doesn't. So I think it's pretty clear that P1, he doesn't hold P1, right? That's not the notion of pity that's in play. Okay. Talk about the dramatic events being the sort of thing that a certain kind of person may well say or do in accordance with probability or necessity might incline you to think that he holds that the pity he is envisaging will be of the P2 variety, that is, directed at the fictional character only insofar as one imagines that character to stand for a kind of character, one who may exist in some general type of situation. Well, however, in distinguishing poetry or fiction from history by reference to universals and particulars in chapter 9 of the Poetics, Aristotle is considering the job or function of the poet, right? So this is an important point here. The job of the poet, the writer of dramatic fiction, is, on his view, not to attempt to portray what actually has happened to someone, but to portray the sorts of things that might happen to a certain kind of person. That's what he's getting at here. He's trying to provide instructions to the poet, to the person who writes dramatic tragedy, and trying to explain the sorts of things that they ought to be doing. They ought to be picking universal themes, not historical events, and then putting some names onto these universal themes. He's describing how the poet goes about constructing a play. But clearly Aristotle's thinking this is compatible with his holding that someone encountering the fiction, an audience member, so a member of the audience, will, so far as the fiction is successful, experience pity about the fictional character as such, right? So his instructions for the poet about how the poet ought to go about constructing plots and so on is compatible with him thinking that an audience member encountering the fiction will experience pity at the fictional character, not at the universal theme. Okay. Indeed, in one of the passages that Price quotes, Aristotle claims that in dramatic tragedy, pity is experienced for a person undeserving of his misfortune. So he experienced pity for a person undeserving of his misfortune. But the only person who's suffered an undeserved misfortune is the fictional character, right? That's the only person, the whole singular, is the only person who suffered an undeserved misfortune is the fictional character here, no one else. So we may grant then that universal themes should be in the mind of the best poets when constructing the best tragedies. We could even perhaps grant that such plays invite the audience to reflect on such universal themes. I think that's highly probable as well. And perhaps Aristotle expects that the best members of the audience would do just that. They would, they would reflect on the universal themes that the play invites them to think about. Even so, though, none of this entails that he holds that the pity that is experienced by the audience encountering that fiction is only about the fictional character insofar as that character is imagined to represent someone who might possibly exist in some situation. In any event, and I think this point is worth noting with respect to Radford's claims too, this is what I want to suggest, even with P2, we are already allowing that it's possible for us to experience emotions directed at fictional characters. And this is a point I want to stress, because I don't think I've got a conclusive argument. I mean, I don't see Aristotle denying that we can experience emotions directed at fictional characters as such, but I don't have a conclusive argument to say that he must construe it. He must allow us to have emotions directed at the fictional characters as such, i.e. P3 rather than P2. But what I want to say is that even with P2, we're already allowing that it's possible for us to experience emotions directed at fictional characters. Remember, P2 said that the pity was fueled by reference to what might be real, right? But although that's the case, and Radford allows that the proposal to be about what a real person might suffer, not just what one takes a real person to have suffered, or what one expects a real person to suffer. So the pity is fueled by reference to what we might be real. It can be the case nonetheless, that we experience emotions in response to scenarios that we know full well have not in fact happened and do not expect to happen to some specific person. The majority of fictional scenarios we encounter are not like the movie Titanic, right? This is the point. I mean, with the movie Titanic, we could see quite easily how you might be having these emotions about a surrogate object, about someone who really did suffer that fate. And I was inviting you to think, well, yeah, can't you also experience the emotion about Jack himself, the fictional character? But the majority of fictional scenarios we encounter aren't like that movie, with fictional characters overlaid on some historical event. In the majority of cases, we know that nobody has in fact suffered in the way presented. And so even if our emotion is about someone who might really suffer, the might here indicates that we're dealing with a counterfactual scenario, a scenario that we know to be not true, to be false. And Aristotle's point about constructing plots on the basis of what might or could happen is emphasizing the same point. Many fictional scenarios concern events that have not happened and are not now specifically expected to happen, even if they could. Thus, when I experience pity about a character, knowing full well that the character is not actually suffering, because there is no such person, and knowing full well that there's no real person that is so suffering, or whom I imminently expect to suffer, I must be experiencing pity about an imagined scenario, even if I'm imagining a scenario in which some real person might actually suffer, and my imagination is fueled by that. So even if my emotional state is in a way fueled or propped up or given the surrogate object by what someone might actually suffer, the fact that the person isn't actually suffering, right, it's just by what someone might suffer, means that even then I'm engaging with an imaginative scenario that someone might suffer, even though nobody actually is. And that is itself already to be having the emotion about a fictional object or imagined object. Okay. So in that sense, the difference between P2 and P3 becomes a secondary matter when we're concerned with our emotional responses to fiction as such. Either allows that we can do just that. Either seems to allow that we can have emotional responses to fictional objects. Okay. And while I suspect we're inclined to agree with Radford that it's possible for pity to be along the lines of P3, where we just experience it directed at the fictional object as such, and I personally can't see Aristotle rejecting this possibility, even though I don't really have a positive argument to show that he does, the same paradox of fiction, as it's termed in aesthetics, i.e. the puzzle about how we can form emotions in response to scenarios we recognize to be fictional, would apply no less to pity of type P2 when we know, in the cases at least, when we know that nobody has in fact suffered the fate in question, and we don't have any direct expectation that someone will, i.e. in cases which aren't like Titanic and aren't directly connected to some specific historical event, but are just fictional scenarios. Then we know that nobody has in fact suffered the fate in question, and we don't expect anyone to be imminently suffering in that way. Then our pity is still directed at a fictional object, an imagined object. But then ultimately, regardless as to whether we have P2 or P3 in mind, Aristotle thinks that we can experience emotions directed at fictional entities, since he clearly doesn't have P1 in mind. Okay, well, now let's turn to fear. In his classic discussion of the emotions we form in response to fiction, Kendall Walton introduced the famous example of Charles watching a horror movie. And what happens is a bit like sort of the film Ghostbusters. Some green slime turns towards the screen and oozes at the audience. And Charles is gripped with panic, holds the chair, sweating, and avows he feels fear. But what I mean, Walton obviously put this to his own ends, which I won't go unless someone wants to pursue the questions. But the example is a good one initially to start thinking about this, because while in such a case we can see how someone might feel fear in response to a fictional object, right? The slime is fearful as it oozes towards the viewer. You're in the grip of fear because the slime appears to be coming at you. Now. So you can see it in that sort of case, but when watching a tragedy, we do not typically feel even imaginatively under threat ourselves, right? It's others who are threatened and in danger, not ourselves. I mean, this was sort of peculiarity of Walton's original example, that the slime oozed at the audience, right? Ordinarily in horror films, it's other people who are about to be attacked, not you yourself. So it's others who are threatened and in danger, not ourselves. Well, so should we then, given that Aristotle isolates fear and pity as the two crucial emotions we experience in response to a dramatic tragedy, should we propose that we feel fear for them, the characters in the play, the tragic heroes, on the assumption that we can feel fear for what we expect to happen to somebody else? So can we have firstly, you think, ordinarily in tragic drama, we're not confronted with things like the green slime. It's other people who are facing the suffering or the terrible situations. So should we say that we can feel fear for them then? Are we feeling fear on their behalf, as it were, the characters in the play, so that this requires us to say that we can feel fear on somebody else's behalf? Well, that might seem to be suggested by one of the passages that Price cited above. Aristotle claims that we feel fear in this context about those similar to ourselves. And with this in view, Stephen Halliwell proposes that Aristotle holds that tragic fear differs from ordinary fear by virtue of being focused on the experience of others. Now, the first thing to ask about this proposal is whether such a notion of fear would square with the account of fear we find Aristotle outline in the Rhetoric. Halliwell thinks that the specification in the Poetics, as he understands it, at least does not contradict the idea that we could feel fear about somebody else or on somebody else's behalf. He notes that the definition of fear in the Rhetoric, which I give you as "let fear be a distress or disturbance arising from the appearance of a future destructive or painful evil," he says, so Halliwell thinks that doesn't stipulate that the emotion must be self-regarding. So he thinks it doesn't contradict, doesn't rule out the idea that we could experience fear on somebody else's behalf. And so he maintains that Aristotle's discussion does not rule out the possibility that its object can, in some cases, be the prospect of others' sufferings. Okay. Well, however, in the paper where we saw Price, quotation where I had Price quoting Nehemias, in the paper that Nehemias is referring to, is Pity and Fear in the Poetics and the Rhetoric, Alexander Nehemias objects to Halliwell's idea He says, he concedes that the notion that fear is essentially self-regarding is not stated in so many words, but nonetheless, he writes, it is directly implied by Aristotle's statement that there are some evils, e.g. wickedness or stupidity, the prospect of which does not frighten us, only such as amount to great pains and losses do. Nehemiah says, this statement makes an unmistakable reference to evils one expects for oneself. And since Aristotle offers it as a direct explication of the definition of fear, it seems that though it does not logically rule out the possibility that objects of fear can sometimes be the sufferings of others, Aristotle considers that possibility very remote indeed. So he thinks this. So Nehemiah thinks that when Aristotle says there are some evils, the prospect of which don't frighten us, only such as amount to great pains and losses do, that makes a reference to evils one expects for oneself. But I think Nehemiah's reasoning is spurious there. Aristotle's point about the evils which can and cannot be objects of fear doesn't specify the person who experiences fear about them. It just indicates the sort of evil that can be the possible objects of fear. Nehemiah would have been better served, I think, by pointing to the fact that Aristotle contrasts pity and fear precisely by reference to whether the events in question are construed as occurring to oneself or someone else. So I'll illustrate. So in his discussion of fear, Aristotle says, simply speaking, the fearsome things are the ones that are pitiable when they happen or are going to happen to others. So things that are fearful for oneself are the things that are pitiable when they happen or are going to happen to others. And in his discussion of pity, he claims the things people fear for themselves are the ones they pity when they are happening to others. So this, is maybe more promising for Nehemiah's view. It might seem to suggest that fear is tied to your own prospects, and pity concerns the same sorts of things when they're happening to others. However, in fact, both Halliwell and Nehemiah miss the key passage, which shows that Halliwell is correct to suppose that Aristotle thinks that we can feel fear for other people. So I think they miss a key passage which shows that Halliwell is right to suppose that Aristotle thinks that we can feel fear for other people. Unfortunately for Halliwell, though, the passage also casts doubt on his understanding of tragic fear, on Halliwell's understanding of tragic fear, and points in favor of a different interpretation of the role and fear of tragedy, which actually, ironically, is closer to Nehemiah's own understanding, as I shall develop that. Let me give you the passage. In his discussion of pity, Aristotle writes this. He says, people pity those they know, provided they are not too closely related to them. If they are, they feel for them as they do about their own sufferings. So people pity those they know, provided they're not too closely related to them. If they are, they feel for them as they do about their own sufferings. This is why Amasis, so it is said, did not weep when his son was led to execution, but did weep when he saw his friend begging, since the latter was pitiable, the former dreadful, deinon, which is obviously closely related to fear, is a terrible object or a terrifying object. For the dreadful is distinct from the pitiable and tends to drive out pity, and is often useful to the opponent, since people no longer pity when something dreadful is close to themselves. So Amasis didn't weep when his son was led to execution. Weeping would have been a sign of him pitying him, because that his son was so close to him that he felt as it says in the top line, he felt about it as he would about his own sufferings. He was terrified. So he was terrified on his son's behalf, felt fear for his son. So this indicates that Aristotle does think that you can experience fear on somebody else's behalf. So the passage, as I've just said, the passage makes it clear that Aristotle thinks we can feel fear on behalf of others when they're closely related to us. Massey didn't pity his son. His son was too close to him for that. Instead, he was afraid on his behalf. And the reason for that is, even though Amasis will not die himself, the suffering is in part his own. Right? It's something that he owns in the same way that a family member is in part one's own. Hence, Aristotle claims that we feel for such people as we do about our own sufferings. But nonetheless, while it's clear that Aristotle holds, I think from that passage, that we can feel fear on behalf of another, it is equally evidently clear, I think, that this is not going to help provide a notion of tragic fear along the lines that Halliwell proposed and wanted. The problem is not especially that it would be strained to construe those we encounter in the fiction as equivalent to family members. I mean, although you might find that somewhat problematic, but it's not necessarily that's the problem. Perhaps you can try and make that work. It's rather that Aristotle also insists that we feel pity for those characters that we encounter in the fiction. We're feeling pity about the tragic heroes in these tragic dramas. And yet he's explicit in the passage that we've just quoted that pity for X and fear for X don't go together. If we pity a tragic character because they're not so close to us, we will not, it seems, feel fear for them. Alternatively, if, like Amasis, we're afraid for someone because that person is so close to us, we won't pity them on Aristotle's view. The two were ruled out. He didn't pity his son. He felt fear for his son. He did pity his friend when he saw him begging. So because that person wasn't quite so close. But as we've seen, Aristotle thinks that we do pity the characters in tragic drama. So he doesn't think they're equivalent to family members effectively. This shows as well. They're sufficiently like us, but they're not so close as to be treated like family members. Aristotle thinks we do pity the characters in tragic drama, hence we will not fear for them as well, given that connection between pity and fear. In effect, we might say that Halliwell's notion of tragic fear is incompatible with Aristotle's notion of tragic pity. Okay, but if we don't feel fear for the tragic character, then what do we fear? Remember, Aristotle has said that these are the two integral emotions to a dramatic tragedy. Well, the fact that the fear in question cannot be directed towards the character one pities might prompt you to envisage a fear parallel to a P1 kind of pity, right? As we noted, it can't be directed at the character that we're pitying. It can't be directed at the tragic hero. So that might prompt you to think, well, perhaps there's a fear of the parallel to the P1 kind of pity. That was a real fear, a real pity in that case. And we saw that was implausible for the kind of pity that Aristotle accounts it for in tragedy. But perhaps it might be the case for the fear that he's referring to. As we noted in the passage that Price cited, Aristotle claims that we feel fear for a person similar to ourselves. Perhaps on the basis of pitying a tragic hero, one feels a real fear directed at the prospect of something similar happening to oneself. Aristotle's definition of pity in the Rhetoric runs as follows. He says, "Let pity then be a sort of distress and an apparently destructive or painful bad thing happening to someone who does not deserve it, and one that a person might expect himself or one of his own to suffer, and this when it appears close at hand." If it's a requirement for experiencing pity that one must expect oneself or one of one's own to suffer a similar fate, perhaps Aristotle holds that in pitying the tragic character, we will also experience a distress at a similar fate occurring to us, that is, feel fear. So this suggestion is that we, in pitying someone, the tragic character in the tragic drama, we might also be experiencing a real fear directed at a similar fate occurring to us, right? Perhaps that's what the fear is, not experienced on behalf of the tragic character, but a real fear for us, which is experienced on the basis of that we might undergo what the tragic character is undergoing. Well, I don't accept this idea, although I think it's edging in the right direction, and there are several problems with it. First, while the expectation clause of the definition of pity entails that I must at least view those events as ones that I or one of my own could undergo, there seems little reason to think that Aristotle holds that in order to experience pity, one must actually construe oneself as in danger of undergoing them, so that pity would then entail fear, or at least pity would entail an intentional state that involves apprehending oneself as in imminent danger. So, in that case, he would be saying that whenever you experience pity, you've also got to be afraid of the very same events occurring to you. But that doesn't seem to be the case, because it seems clear that from later on in his discussion of pity, that the closeness of hand that he's referring to in the final clause of definition that I quoted refers not to the subject viewing the things that happen to the pitied person as highly probable to happen to her, the pitier. Rather, it pertains to the fact that those things that have just happened or are about to happen are more pitiable because they appear before our eyes, right? It seems that's what that bit of the clause. If you look at the chapter on pity, that bit of the definition gets picked up towards the end of the chapter, and that's what he elaborates it with. Thus, the expectation clause would presumably be met by us envisaging that we could suffer in the way that the pitied person did, even if we do not in fact believe that we are imminently faced with such a prospect. Otherwise, we'd have a rather restrictive notion of pity. We wouldn't be able to pity anyone unless we thought that, unless we were afraid of that, directly afraid of that very same thing happening to ourselves right now. Whereas that seems rather odd. Why shouldn't it be the case that we can't pity people without being imminently in threat of that same danger occurring to ourselves? What the expectation clause rules out instead isn't that, but cases in which we think that there's no chance, however remote, that we could undergo a similar fate, right? So if we think there's no possibility that whatever that we could undergo a similar fate, then the expectation clause would rule out our experiencing pity there. The notion that this could happen to us, is for Aristotle integral to our experiencing distress about it happening to another. But that doesn't require that we actually now think it's likely to happen to us or is going to happen to us. It being possible that it could happen to us is enough. If there's no way in which I view it can happen to me at all, then on Aristotle's view, I'm going to find it hard to feel pity. That doesn't mean I have to now think it's going to happen to me. It's possible it could. In some possible scenario happen to me. That's all that his requirement seems to entail, I think. So the fact that we experience pity does not itself entail that we experience fear for a similar fate. Second, in any event, so that's the first consideration against this view. But second, in any event, which is that, the view now we're considering is that the fear is of a sort of equivalent to a P1, that we experience a real fear that the thing might occur to ourselves. And I've given you one objection to that view. A second is, in any event, as we've seen, the pitied object is, or at least can be, an entirely fictional one. And so it's unclear that the expectation clause requires anything other than that we imaginatively take the events to be ones that could occur to ourselves. After all, tragedies frequently employ or involve plots that we could not seriously entertain or an imminent prospect for ourselves in our current situation. I don't think I'm imminently faced with the situation that Oedipus was in, heaven forbid, right? So they involve plots that we couldn't seriously entertain that are imminent prospects for ourselves in our current situation. Aristotle is surely not then envisaging that the fear that he appears to think accompanies tragedy in general is one that concerns events that we think might imminently happen to ourselves in reality. The fact that in tragedy we view the tragic hero as having suffered some tragic undeserved misfortune will be enough to warrant pity, but it will not all on its own warrant our feeling fear at the real prospect of something similar happening to us. But what further alternative is there, though? Well, here's another alternative. After asserting his view, which we've seen is mistaken, that Aristotle holds that fear is essentially self-regarding, Nehemus asks the following question. He says, does this mean that we can no longer attribute to Aristotle a view to the effect that the theatrical audience imaginatively or sympathetically feels fear on behalf of the characters of tragedy? Is there no sense in which I can fear for Oedipus as I see him rushing headlong, though totally unaware, into destruction? He answers, there is indeed a sense in which I can. I can imagine what I would feel like if I were in Oedipus's place, with the knowledge I now possess, knowing what I know, and also seeing myself doomed to perform the actions he is destined for. I will indeed be very much afraid. This is really an imaginative fear for myself, but is a fear for myself, which is based on seeing myself as someone relatively similar to Oedipus, or as someone whom the character of Oedipus is a part. Well, here Nehemias refers to feeling an imaginative fear for myself. This is not a fear directed at a prospect I believe to be real, but a fear directed at a fictional scenario prompted by envisaging what it would be like if I were to be in a situation relevantly similar to Oedipus's. Given Aristotle's accounts of pity and fear, I cannot be afraid for Oedipus if I'm also to pity him, and I would effectively have to view him as a family member in order for the former in any case. Equally, given that viewers need not think they're actually in Oedipus's position, heaven forbid, there is no reason to believe that Aristotle thinks that the fear he connects to tragedy concerns fear of a prospect the viewer takes to be real, right? So there's no reason that was the other alternative that I ruled out. But he could think that tragedy, or at least the best tragedies, can prompt us to experience fear directed at our fictionally imagining that we're in the same boat as poor old Oedipus, right? So there's no reason to think that it's going to prompt me to feel that I've got a real fear directed at these events occurring to me. But the best tragedies could prompt us to experience fear directed at our fictionally imagining that we're in the same situation as Oedipus. Such an object of our fear is perfectly compatible with pitying Oedipus, since it's got a different object, right? So we can pity the fictional character, pity Oedipus, and that's compatible with this kind of fear, because this fear concerns an imaginative project of our own. But note, if this is the sort of thing that Aristotle has in mind in linking tragedy to fear, it's worth emphasizing that here too our emotion is directed at an object that we take to be fictional. Thus, we have further reason to reject the quasi-perceptualist judgmentalist view that Aristotle holds that in order to possess an emotion, the subject must take things to be the way her emotion presents them. On the account I've developed then, the pity and fear we experience in response to tragedy have different imaginative bases. The pity we experience pertains to the fictional scenario as presented as happening in the tragedy itself. The fear we experience pertains to the further fictional scenario that the fictional tragedy prompts us to envisage, namely imagining ourselves to be facing those self-same circumstances. And that can be more or less hard to imagine. And in some situations, if it's very hard to imagine, it maybe such a fictional fear may not occur. But that's the suggestion. This gives our response to tragedy a two-tier imaginative structure. At the first level, we witness the fictional events unfold, and owing to our make-believedly believing the character has suffered or will suffer some undeserved misfortune, we experience pity directed at the fictional character. At the same time, successful instances of the genre may also prompt us to engage in a further imaginative exercise prompted by the tragic fiction. This involves us imagining ourselves to be in the same situation as the tragic protagonist. In this respect, the fear we form in response to such fictional scenarios is directly parallel to the fear that Charles experiences, in Walton's example, when watching the movie with the green slime lunging towards the camera. It pertains, that is, to something that we make-believedly believe is dangerous to us. The difference is between this and this case of tragic drama and the case of the slime is that in the case of the slime, the movie itself presents the fictional scenario, whereas in the case of fear in connection to tragedy, the tragedy presents the events as occurring to someone else. And this, in the best cases, prompts a further imaginative exercise pertaining to how it might feel if that happened to us. But although the pity and fear we experience in response to tragedy have that difference, nonetheless, we experience both emotions about fictional events as such. One is about the fictional event, the fictional character. The other is about a fictional scenario that might occur to us, that we imagine could occur. So I've argued that Aristotle doesn't seek the factive solution to the problem posed by our emotional responses to fiction that some commentators have proposed. This makes no sense for pity, I want to say, and even fear is most plausibly directed at a fictional object, albeit not one that is represented in the fiction itself. Thus, against both the quasi-perceptualist and the judgmentalist reasoning, insofar as they share this feature, that assent is required for emotions, I think that his account of tragic drama, the emotions we experience in response to tragic drama, most indicates that he most plausibly holds that we can form emotions about objects that we do not assent are as the emotion represents them to us. So I've picked up a part of my project here, which is my bigger project, which is that assent isn't required we don't have to assent that objects of emotions are as they are represented, as our emotion represents them to us. So that, if that's correct, that would be problematic for the quasi-perceptualist view and the judgmentalist view. There's a separate argument to undermine perceptualist views, which would also undermine quasi-perceptualist views, insofar as I don't think that Aristotle holds that objects of emotions must be apprehended by the capacity of fantasia, but he thinks that some can be about their objects just insofar as they're represented by belief or thought. But I haven't argued that here. But anyway, what I focused on is the idea that he thinks that assent is necessary for emotions, and I've done my best to resist that. But I'd be interested to know what you think. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Giles, for your presentation. We have already got some questions here by the debaters. The first one is Lucas. I will put them in an alternate fashion on the screen so you guys can have a closer debate. Lucas, welcome. Please, your question.
Thank you, Giles.
Thanks,
well, I have some difficulties formulating my question because it's not my field. I'm not concentrated on this, so I don't know this literature very well. But what I would like to know is, to put it in a few words in advance, is what exactly would be the sort of universal term that would be involved in the object of emotion. So if we suppose that the object of emotion has a quasi-propositional structure, whatever, so we feel that someone is F, for instance. It's not like knowing that this in front of me is a horse or is a table or whatever, but it's grasping or feeling that something is pitiable or is fearable, etc., etc. But then I wonder if it helps to your proposal to dwell on this issue a little bit more, because in the Poetics chapter 9 passage in which Aristotle contrasts history and poetry, he uses this sentence I have here in front of mine. Is 1451b8 I'm referring to. He says that the universal, the katolo, is what kind of things happens to what kinds of people to say or to do. But then I wonder what exactly is encoded into those poio. So because one idea might be like this: well, this poios has suffered that. Would be what kind of people like me, people that is sufficiently likened to me, so that I must fear that it is plausible that the same thing might happen to me. But how this should be cashed out in terms of being like to me, or being similar to me in terms of belonging to the same people, or belonging to the same sort of ethical group, or belonging to the same, or something more fine-grained in the direction of taking in the text those two complements in line 9, this katato ekos and katato anankaion, as actually modifying the content of poia. What I mean is this: so Aristotle is saying that universal is what some kind of person happened to do or say according to the probability or the necessity. I think that this, according to probability and necessity, necessarily put what one character is doing in a play into a perspective. So what he or she is doing stems as a result, probable or necessary result of something other. But maybe this something other is not just one more thing, it's a bunch of things taken as a whole. So in a way, we are considering this sort of things that might happen to given sort of people as actually very complex. And then the issue we might raise, and it relates to this contrast between your P1, P2, P3. The issue we might raise is not, well, is this exactly the same thing might happen to me, or a thing sufficiently similar to that might happen to me? But then the question is more like, well, a very complex situation in the moral point of view like this might happen not only to me, but to people pretty much similar to what we take to be human beings, etc., in a given situation. So just to point, to give an example might be useful. Someone is suffering an injustice. Someone suffers any kind of injustice. We can pick up a movie or whatever, a play, and pinch the character and focus on the specific event that has happened. So the question is, what we are reacting to is not exactly the fact that, for instance, someone has his things stolen or something like that. We are reacting to something much bigger, so the fact that in a given very complex situation in which the character has done a lot of things, then a bunch of other things has happened in such a way that the whole package is unjust, and that's what we are reacting to. So this is, I don't know if it's intelligible, but exactly in this direction is what I want to hear you about.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I'd probably like you to come back, but but let me say a couple of things. I mean, first of all, you began by making some comments about what's the sort of universal that emotions are about. Now, in one sense, there's an answer to that in terms of the emotions themselves, right? Because emotions have what we term in contemporary terminology, since Anthony Kenny at least, formal objects, right? And Aristotle has these. So fear, it's danger or great physical pain, the prospect of that. Pity is directed at the undeserved suffering of another, and that these are sort of formal objects that must occur in any case of pity or in fear, and each emotion has its own formal object that distinguishes it from, well, it doesn't quite distinguish it. I mean, actually, in fact, this is a slightly important point with respect to contemporary philosophy, because as I understand Aristotle, he thinks that you can have two emotions directed at the same formal object, one pleasure-based and one pain-based. So, for example, you could experience pain about someone suffering some undeserved misfortune, and that would be pity, or you could experience pleasure directed at someone suffering some undeserved misfortune, and that would be Schadenfreude, which, I mean, and he has epikairokakia. It is literally Schadenfreude. He recognizes this emotion. But nonetheless, the formal property, in conjunction with the pleasure or the hedonic flavor, as it were, of the emotion, distinguish the different emotion types. So in order for you to get any kind of pity or any kind of fear, you've got to construe the fictional object or the real object on subspecies the formal property, the formal object of that emotion type. So where we're looking to see a fear in the fiction case, or see a pity, we've got some particulars that are going on. They can be as rich or as textured as you like, but we've got to be construing those events under the rubric of the formal object in order for us to be able to experience the emotion in question. So when it comes to fear, we've got to be seeing some danger, right? Now, as I sort of try to labor, we might be able to experience fear on behalf of another, But that's not going to do the work here, because that's ruled out for various reasons here. That we can't be fearing on behalf of the tragic character, because we're experiencing pity for them, and pity and fear don't go together. They're unhappy bedfellows, as it were. So the fear's got to have a different object, but still that object has got to be one that we construe as dangerous in some way. And I offered you this one, based on Namus, as the danger connected to yourself, in some way, imagining yourself to be in the situation of the tragic, the tragic protagonist. Now, when you come to the 9 passage that you're highlighting, which I think I quoted this passage as well. There he's distinguishing between poetry and history, and saying that poetry speaks of universals and history of particulars. And yes, then he gets into this complicated way in which a universal is a sort of thing that a certain kind of person may well say or do in accordance with probability and necessity. And there's complex ways in which this might be understood. One thought there is that the best tragic dramas are going to have to appear that they unfold as a matter of necessity. They can't be just sort of whimsical contingent events, like a big storm comes across or something like that. It's got to be somehow built into the nature of the plot. It looks like it's inevitable that it's going to occur. That's one element to it. But I take it another element there is that though we've got particular characters in the dramatic narrative, they're meant to have not idiosyncratic quirks of particular individual, except insofar as those could be in some way generalized or become kinds of things, kinds of traits that can gel. I think it's about familiarity, so that the audience can get a grip on what's happening and why it's happening, in the same way that we don't want sort of random events to occur, but the things to occur as a result of necessity. We want the characters to be recognizable kinds in certain ways that can then map onto. And that, I think, it's highly, but you're absolutely right. Obviously the events there, the universe in question could be highly subtle and highly contextualized and highly nuanced. But I take it I suppose there's going to have to be sort of layers and layers of which are going to generate things like, yes, this was an unjust act or whatever. But in order to get to the key is that in order to get to an emotion, we're going to have to find in that layer somewhere something that's deemed to be dangerous to, and since an emotion is either to you or to someone else, and in order to experience pity, we've got to have pity directed at a character who is suffering some undeserved misfortune. Now, the misfortune itself can be highly elaborate and complex, but the person's got to be viewed subspecies that formal object of the emotion. But I would like you to come back, because you said a lot, and you ranged over a lot of different topics, so I don't want to have missed out anything that I should have done. So please do come back.
No, I think I'm satisfied. So the question was not so clearly phrased, actually, because it's a mess in my mind. But maybe we should have the others in the debate. Then I can come back to this again.
But thanks for your question, Lucas. Thanks.
Okay, so now we have Gabriela Rossi. She also has more question. Gabriela, thank you very much for coming. Welcome to our symposium.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giles. I enjoyed very much your presentation. And I have only a very small question, more of a clarification or an elaboration about...
They're always the hardest to answer. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. I was thinking about the factive solution that you reject, and if I got it right, the factive solution said that what moves you in a play or in a movie or whatever is not what happens to the character, but what might happen to you, or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's the sort of egocentric version that the Price initially offered. It was then sort of generalized to allow what could happen to other people as well. But yeah.
So my question or my ask for explanation is that it sounds a lot similar to your final explanation of a tragic fear. So that a tragic fear would be something that you imagine that could happen to yourself if you were in the same situation. So it is. It sounded a lot in my mind, a lot like the factive solution. So I wanted to ask you, why is it different from the factive solution?
Well, yeah, because I suppose so. That's the bit there that involves that distinction is the distinction between whether this is something that I think is going to happen to me or is merely imagined to happen to me. I mean, I think. I mean, I think you make a good point there, because so I draw a distinction, right? So I don't think the fear is one that imminently is going to occur to me. So I don't think I'm imminently faced with the prospect of being Oedipus, right? So I can't.
Yeah.
My fear can't. You know, I pity Oedipus, but I can't fear that that's actually going to happen to me. The suggestion is I might be able to, in an imaginative project, that what would it be like if I were Oedipus and were in that situation, and then feel fear. Then my fear, it has me as the the target, but it's entirely an imaginative object. You see, it's an imagined scenario, not a real scenario. I don't really think I'm in that situation. Now, I think some of the, I mean, I just got it up on my other screen. So I think some of the ways that Price puts it come closer to that case in the case of fear, right? So I mean, he says that. But he seems to think that means that we're not experiencing. I mean, so Price is making a general solution about both pity and fear, right? So this sort of parallel only applies with the case of fear, because in my view, the pity is about the character itself, right? It's not pitying a situation that might occur to myself. So the very least, Price is overgeneralizing, but I don't see it as a factive. I mean, maybe the factive solution, as I understand it, should say that I feel fear because I think this might imminently happen to myself. And so I think some have advanced that view. But the way Price actually put it with respect to it, he says might happen to oneself. Now, I don't think might happen to oneself is strong enough to generate a factive solution. So maybe it's sort of mischaracterized as a factive solution there, because the mere prospect I mean, it might depend on how strong the might is, right? If he means, because fear concerns prospects. So if you think I expect it to happen to me, and I view it as something that's likely to happen to me, but of course fear allows the possibility it might not, right? So I mean, fear concerns prospects. Prospects needn't happen. In fact, if they're absolutely determined, Aristotle will say fear leaves you because you're just resigned at that point. So fear's got to have some sort of possibility of escape. So, but if the might then is, anticipate enough to cause fear, then that might well be the factive solution. In which case, that I don't think is the correct way to view it, because that would be like me thinking I'm expecting to suffer the same fate as Oedipus. That would give. So, right. Sorry. If the factive solution is going to be a strict factive solution, then it should be saying that it's a genuine fear directed at a real prospect, whether or not that prospect actually occurs. That's what I think the factive solution should say. That's not the solution I'm proposing, because the proposal I'm proposing is that I know full well that this isn't going to happen to me, but I'm engaging in an imaginative project. What would it be like if I was in Oedipus's situation? Then I would feel, I could make believedly feel fear, just as I can sort of imagine all sorts of counterfactual scenarios. I imagine myself, sat there on a beach in Rio drinking a tequila sunrise or something like that, and experience joy at that prospect, right? But I know it's not real. Now, so this is the factive solution needed by the quasi-perceptualists is that it really is a real emotion, i.e. there is some genuine prospect of this occurring to you, which you genuinely fear. The solution I'm proposing at the end is this is a make-believe enterprise. It's something you're engaging with as an act of make-believe. without any prospect of you expecting that to occur. Sorry, so I think I mean,
I get. So it's like
really good for me because I as they often are, because I'll let you come back in a second, but because it reveals the sort of ambiguity in that Price quotation. I think I know what he needs given his quasi-perceptualist view. It can't be as as you might read my final solution, even for the case of fear. Obviously, can't mean it for pity. But it is helpful to more sharply distinguish those three cases.
So so there are like two mights. One might is a factive might, and what you're proposing is an imaginative might or something like that, right? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's right. So it's sort of it's just because fear concerns future prospects, right?
Yeah.
So there's a might occur in the sense that anything that I'm going to fear in real life, right? I might fear, I don't know, catching the coronavirus, right? Anything that's something I could expect to occur. That's not a fictional scenario. Whereas this is a, this what I'm engaging in the end. It's not something I take to be real, but just an imaginative project. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Great, thank you.
So I will go now. Breno has also a question, but he has a little bit of a shaky connection today. Maybe he will get to ask it after me. So I loved your presentation. Thank you very much. And I have to say that you touched on a point that, a lot of the times makes me feel like an awful person. Because when I'm watching something like with anybody, a friend, my mother, my girlfriend, and they actually feel pity for characters. And I find that very hard. The fact that they're fictional, it somehow blocks me. And my question is this: I am very much persuaded by your interpretation that Aristotle allows that one might feel pity for the character. But the problem I have with the rhetoric is like, especially book 2, he gives you a definition of an emotion, and then he tells you towards which persons we usually feel it and for which reasons. But I always miss a closer connection. I mean, I always take him not to be saying, this is the people you should feel that emotion towards. I take him to be saying, this is the people against you normally feel this emotion towards. So the question I'm asking is whether you agree with that, and the follow-up would be this. What is the point of feeling pity or feeling emotions in general towards imaginative characters? Why should we do it?
Yeah, that's the old paradox of tragedy, and there's various solutions. Why do we undergo negative emotions when they're negative emotions? Why should we go to go and watch a play if we know that it's very likely going to result in us feeling distressing emotions? And one of the standard sort of proposals in response to that is that we do it at the service of some other end, right? Some benefit. As I mentioned in the presentation, that Aristotle thinks that we take pleasure in these events as well, and that seems tied to the idea that we take pleasure in representation and the representational narratives. So I think it can be rational for you to put yourself in a situation in which you experience negative emotions if you think there's going to be some positive end to be gained from that. So something might be something you learn, or something. This doesn't need to be explicitly thought of, but I think if you explicitly thought of going to a tragedy and just imagined you were going to experience negative emotions and get nothing else out of it, then I think it wouldn't be rational for you to go to. The same sort of situation occurs with some people with respect to horror, right? I don't particularly like watching horror movies. I just find I don't really get any. I know that people who like horror movies get a sort of thrill or a buzz out of watching them. I don't really get that. I get sort of just the negative emotions, and don't really enjoy them. So it's not rational for me to go and watch horror movies. It could be rational for me to go and watch tragedies, even if I find them disturbing, because I might think I might learn something or gain some, insights into, think of Antigone, for example. You might gain insights into the way conflicts might occur between the state and family ties, family bounds, and things like that. I bet you yeah, I mean, you began by saying that you don't experience pity in response to fictional characters. I bet you experience some emotions. Even if you don't experience, you may not be particularly prone to pity, but I bet you experience some emotions directed at fictional characters themselves, even while you know that they're fictional. Think of your famous. Think of your most the movies that you most like, for example, that you know full well are fictional, and imagine the emotions you experience about the character succeeding or doing something like that. I bet you'll find that you experience emotions directed at the fictional character achieving that or doing something like that.
Yeah.
There was something about the rhetoric. Yeah. Well, so what's going on in the rhetoric is that Aristotle's trying to provide the orator with effectively the tools to be able to engender or abate emotions in his or her audience. And he's got this threefold schema that he employs to do that. So he gives definition, and then he has this bit which often picks out the formal property of this epipoios bit, where it says which is directed at what. And sometimes these headings get muddled a bit. Then he has the at whom it's directed at. And then the other one is post diacomenoi, which is the sort of conditions under which it occurs. The sorts of information that get put into these categories can vary a little bit, but it's not. I mean, what he's trying to do is provide the orator with valuable information about the kinds of, when he's saying that, so the sorts of people you get angry at, for example, will be of this kind. The sorts of people that you get pity at are this kind. Then the orator will have that information, may be able to use that information valuably to try and engender pity or engender anger as may be appropriate in the audience. So some aspect of it is not about providing an account of the emotions, sort of as we find in a philosophy of mind text, but about what would be helpful for the orator in his or her quest to engender emotions insofar as they can bear on the audience's krises, their decisions or verdicts, not well translated by judgment. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it helps. Just a quick follow-up, because like when you see the beginning of the Poetics, and he talks about how you can learn and even deduce, right, from the tragedy. There seems to be something that you can do there, and that is valuable and does not depend on you experiencing the emotion. Of course, you can experience the emotion, and maybe you will experience the emotion once you have the judgment instilled in you. Like, so you understand the situation the person needs and experience. But there's the other possibility too, which is the one Plato kept emphasizing in the end of the Republic, which is the habituation of feeling that emotion in those circumstances specifically. And if that is the case, then you actually need to experience that emotion in terms of fictional characters. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if this is to count as a part of a process of habituation, if Aristotle is interested in habituating people to feel pity against the right people at the right time and etc., then he would have to allow that not only one can, but one should feel pity in those cases too. So in order for them to count as a part of their habituation processes.
Yeah, I mean that's a task. That's a question for his ethics, not for his poetics.
Okay.
I mean, his poetics. I mean, what's required for the person to experience pity is that they construe the character as having what a necessary condition is that they construe the character as having suffered some undeserved misfortune. That's not sufficient, because they've got to also experience distress at that. Now, if you've got a load of people coming to watch a Greek tragedy, and they're finding it hilarious about the situation that Oedipus has got into, or Antigone is getting to, and they're experiencing Schadenfreude. They're still understanding the play in some respect, because they're experiencing, they're grasping that the person suffered some undeserved misfortune. But there's a hedonic aspect that they're meant to be bringing to the play, which is a distress directed at those events, which someone experiencing Schadenfreude wouldn't be experiencing. And I think Aristotle would think that that's a matter of upbringing, and that is a matter of character. And I think he would think that you're sort of getting a deeply impoverished experience if you're going to Oedipus and laughing your head off. But I mean, actually, in terms of the sort of content or the object of the emotion, or at least the sort of the formal property of the emotion, it's there whether you're laughing or not. So there is a sort of level at which the cognitive content can be apprehended independently of whether you have the right emotional response to it. But Aristotle clearly thinks that his audience that are watching dramatic tragedy have been brought up correctly and therefore are experiencing. I mean, what he's talking about is sort of what the best poets would produce in the best audience, if you like. So they've already achieved their upbringing by the time they're experiencing pity and not experiencing Schadenfreude in response to these tragic dramas.
Okay. Thank you very much, Giles. We have Breno now for the next question.
Sure.
Hi, Giles. Thank you for your presentation. I found it very convincing, and I would just like to have a better grasp of this two-tier imaginative process that you suggested at the end of your presentation. And I was thinking about those. A very common reaction in horror movies is like to scream very loudly instructions to the characters, which are usually very stupid, and we like close the window, close the door, something like that.
Yeah.
And I think about this this image that you of a green slime moving towards the camera.
Yeah.
And I was, when you're giving that example, I was thinking about Rhetoric 2:5. That passage in which Aristotle says that fear prompts us to think about what can be done in a given situation. And when the character is in a hopelessness situation, it doesn't cause us fear. It doesn't cause fear because we don't. It's not a kind of situation in which something can be done, so we don't start thinking about what can be done. So I was. Would like to see if this is a good characterization of what you have in mind, namely that the fictional or the fictional character or the fictional situation in which the character finds himself or herself in causes fear when it sort of engages us in thinking and about how to act in a similar situation. So that doesn't concern whether the risk is something that actually can be done to us. So it's not the fear of the possibility of something like that happening to us. Yeah. But as long as we put ourselves in the position of the character, we sort of start thinking as if we were in the same situation. And that I was associating your claim to that sort of process. I would like to confirm whether this it's a fair representation of what you were trying to advance.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Breno. Thanks for that. That's right. So all I've given you is that when I sort of work through various possibilities of fear, all I sort of lumped you in at the end with was that you're not fearing a real prospect or real situation, as you emphasize. You're engaged in some kind of imaginative project, which is stimulated by the fictional characters that you're encountering. You're experiencing pity about the fictional character, and then you're engaged in an imaginative, a sort of make-believe project that what if I were in this situation? And your fear is directed at an imaginary object, namely it's you facing that situation, faced that imaginary scenario, and yes, insofar as fear prompts one to engage in deliberative projects about how you get out of it. I don't think he thinks. I mean, well, that's but insofar as fear does that, right? That will take place too at the imaginative level. So I will be in this imaginative project, imagining what I'd be like if I was facing this situation of some tragic hero, and then I would be now in that situation. What could is there a way out of it? What could I do? How could I get out of it? How could I deal with this situation? Because fear prompts me to try and think about ways in which I can deal with the fear. I mean, for example, and this could be at the level of an imaginative, since this is all operating at the level of the imagination, it might be that I might appeal to another fictional character, saying maybe if I could get them to help, they could save me or something like that, right? So yes, it's all operating at the level of the fiction, and that's right. The sorts of thought processes that fear would entail, or fear might entail, could occur at that stage. Bear in mind, though, that fear isn't itself the deliberation. That's what fear prompts, right? So fear is experiencing distress at the danger that I construed to be, say, in this case, the imagined danger, and experiencing distress at the imagined danger, and that will then prompt me to engage in this imaginative, deliberative process about how I might imaginatively, make-believely get out of this situation. To give another example of a different emotion, if you have anger prompted at some fictional character, anger might prompt you, in Aristotle's view, anger involves a desire. It involves you desiring to be able to get revenge on them, right? Now, it's still taking place at the fictional level. It's not a problem. It doesn't mean I have to view myself as able to grab the fictional characters. I mean, I'm engaged in an imaginative project. So yeah, I mean, and it's a nice idea, isn't it? Because I take it your thought was meant to be, was a helpful one, meant to be a helpful one, because you're pointing out that this can link in and sink in to the sorts of experiences that we often have when we're watching movies, where we want to say we're trying to deliberate for them, as it were, and saying, well, you do this, do that, close the window, get out of the way, go take the other route, that sort of thing. And then when we start imagining it, we're trying to put ourselves into the position of the person and see, would we be able to have made those decisions given the information that we would have in the fiction, or is it just because we're seeing it from outside that we can see that we could make it? So I think there's all sorts of interesting questions about there, which will occur about how we slide between the sort of omniscient, or not quite omniscient, but the viewer point, to then when we engage in the imaginative project of being the character, or being something like where the character's faced with, and clearly that's going to be complex. When we put ourselves into the position of character, we might find that some of the things that we thought we'd like to appeal to, we can't really, because we wouldn't have known them, if you see what I mean. I wouldn't have known that closing the window would prevent but we might well find in some of the situations that it's just obvious, and that person is gripped with terror and therefore not doing it, and we can do it, or we can shout for help or something like that. So was I latching on to what you were going?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I was could we say that so the fear is not the deliberation, but the emotion that sort of prepares and triggers a sort of a very efficient and quick deliberation in face of a immediate threat. But could we say that those perceptual stimuli that sort of are more likely to put the audience in a position to deliberate about the alternatives involved are the kind of perceptual input that causes fear? Would you agree that this is something that perhaps Aristotle would accept? And I was thinking about your example about the green slime makes me think about how cinematography can be used to produce fear, and that happens precisely when the way the director composes movement with the camera sort of engages the audience in this situation that, if not immediately makes the audience deliberate, at least you can see how it points to or at least is at least an invitation to deliberations, like the monster coming towards the camera is an obvious way of the fear can be somehow unconscious, or not unconscious, but immediate and very intuitive. But of course, when the monster is moving towards the camera, is the kind of perceptual input that sort of prepares the psychological process of sort of deliberation in a similar situation, and so on. So,
that's right. I think the perceptual cues in a film the imagery that a writer will employ to generate these can trigger these sorts of things. That's right. And I think, I mean, it was a peculiar feature of Walton's example that he chose a case where the viewer was actually experiencing fear directed at the slime, because, as I said, ordinarily when we're watching these things, we're not in danger ourselves, but here the slime lunges at the camera, and all of a sudden it's directed directly at us, and we think, oh gosh, now I'm the one facing this slime, not just those people. And I think that that's, I mean, that will then that then might prompt you to sit there and think, gosh, how can I get away from the slime? But Walton, interestingly, when he used this example, thought that it showed that we didn't experience genuine emotions to fiction. He said Charles would say he's afraid, but is he really? And what he thought was that the reason we could show that he wasn't really afraid is because he doesn't go running out of the cinema phoning the police and screaming that there's slime on the loose. But I think that misses the fact that even when he's engaged with the slime, Charles is engaged in an imaginative project. So the appropriate response is an imaginative one, namely wanting to escape from the slime or whatever within the imaginative framework, not actually leaving the cinema. That's to slide back into the real framework. So I would disagree with them, but certainly all the sorts of perceptual cues that directors employ to build up all our emotional states and trigger our responses, creaking doors, shadows, and so on, enable them to trigger and the music, of course, to trigger emotional reactions into us. Clear how, I don't, as I said, I don't like horror movies, so I don't spend a lot of time watching them, but it's not always clear to me what emotions we're meant to be experiencing, whether it's meant to be these sort of surrogate fears on behalf of the character, or whether it's just some sort of general sense of apprehension or whatever when we're watching them. But I'm not quite sure. But maybe you're more of a fan of the genre.
I am, but I don't have a good answer to your question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That was a really good question.
Okay, so Giles, we have one question from the audience only. It's a question from someone who, like me, is interested in ethics. I hope you don't mind it. And it's sometimes kind of a general question. We have Guilherme Guterres. He says he's a PhD student from Unicinos. And he asks whether you think that the difference between the imaginative basis of fear and pity that you mentioned has any reflection on a possible ethical dimension of tragedy.
Yeah. Right. So, the ethical dimension of the pity then is directed at you experiencing, insofar as you experience pity, you experience distress directed at the undeserved suffering of the tragic character. And so the ethical dimension of that is that Aristotle would think that you ought to be experiencing distress directed at this event. You've got to do two things. You've first got to construe the character as having suffered some undeserved misfortune, and then you've got to experience distress at that, and that will require you to have a correct ethical upbringing. And if you, I sort of mentioned this a bit earlier in response to another question, but if you don't experience pity in that situation, then or experience joy, you experience Schadenfreude, then that will be a definite ethical marker. So in any 2.6, Aristotle lists epikairakakia, which is Schadenfreude, as an emotion that it's always wrong to feel. So you should never feel it. You should never experience Schadenfreude. Bear in mind that that's experiencing joy at someone's undeserved misfortune, right? Not at someone's misfortune. You can experience joy. It's appropriate to experience joy at someone's deserved misfortune in Aristotle's view, and that has another ethical dimension. But so the pity that you experience, that people experience in response to tragic drama, has got an ethical dimension to it, insofar as only those who've been inculcated and habituated the appropriate states or had the appropriate upbringing education will experience distress in that situation, rather than say joy or not experience any hedonic aspect. The fear may be more complicated to link it to a specific ethical value. I mean, because this is engaging in an imaginative project where you're imagining yourself to be in the same situation and experiencing distress directed at the danger. And then, as Breno pointed out, that may prompt you into all sorts of deliberative things, deliberative aspects that you may want to then pursue in your imaginative project. And fear obviously is crucial for Aristotle in the Ethics, insofar as it underlies his virtue of courage. And there's various different views about that, and I have a view. My view is that he thinks that the courageous agent does experience fear, at least experiences fear as a distress directed at the prospect of his or her own death, but is motivationally fearless. So he has another notion of fear which ties to a motivation, and so the courageous agent would be motivationally fearless, i.e. would stand up to their fear. So I suppose even in your imaginative fearful project in response to the tragedy, you could in your imaginative project manifest some kind of ethical trait there, insofar as if the events really were genuinely fearful in your imaginative project, and you experienced fear directed at that, that would be appropriate if it's in line with what the courageous agent would fear. But equally, if you were truly courageous, ought to be motivationally fearless in that situation. So I think both of the emotions there could be sort of synced in, as it were, if you like, to an ethical upbringing, an ethical background, that the people who are going to get these aspects in response to the best tragedies are going to have correct ethical upbringings to truly get the experience that I think Aristotle wants them to have. I hope that helps.
Okay, so we have no more questions from the audience, and no more questions from the debaters. So I'm just bringing everybody up to say goodbye. I'd like to thank everybody once again for their presence. Our symposium will now take a short break, but we'll return in September with our second edition. We have already confirmed a few lectures by several guests. Gabriela Rossi is going to speak to us next year. Thank you, Gabriela, for accepting our invitation. I hope I have more updates on the site in the next weeks with all the pertinent information from our next speakers. Bye, everybody. Hope to see you all again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.